What's up guys, the Strong Boys 19 here. This is going to be my response to your answers from a question video that I've posted on my channel many weeks ago by this point on classic albums that many people love that you guys can't get into. I want to say thank you very much to the participating people who decided to answer away with their picks. Respect My Authorita says, I could never get into Odyssey and Oracle by the Zombies. I respect its impact and I love its cover artwork, but the only song on it I really like is Time of the Season. It's just an average album for me. For me personally, I really like the album quite a lot. And even though there are tons of other psychedelic rock and bluesy style classics with pop melodies here and there, I think Odyssey and Oracle by the Zombies is a great album. It is also one of the other ones that not many people have been citing as, you know, like one of the top psychedelic rock albums, which is kind of a shame because yes, we love Jimi Hendrix Experience to Beatles and Cream, etc., you know, Jefferson Airplane, but this album by the Zombies definitely deserves so much more recognition. But that's fair enough that you cannot get into the album. And yeah, as you mentioned about the cover artwork, it is one of my favorites, especially for what it represents around that time in the psychedelic movement. Thank you very much for that comment. Respect My Authorita. Ryan Rupre, his answers are pretty lengthy and I'll read them out all the way through. As much as I love Pink Floyd's music, I've always cited The Wall as the most overrated albums of their career. Roger Waters pretty much orchestrated the album's creation and development, and there's very little contributions from the other Floyd members, Wright, Gilmour, and Mason. Yet Gilmour did amazing guitar solos on songs like Comfortably Numb. I've always found The Wall as more of a Roger Waters album than a Pink Floyd album. I simply see a Pink Floyd album like Medal, Animals, and Wish You Were Here, which is a fantastic album, and I know for a fact that you praise that album as one of your favourites. Though I also see The Dark Side of the Moon as another classic album that is often overlooked. You mean overrated, Ryan? I still enjoy the songs Time and Us and Them as really good songs. I don't see The Wall at all as more or less a Roger Waters solo effort because it does have most of Pink Floyd's members to begin with, even though Richard Wright was not involved throughout the whole creativity on The Wall's concept and, you know, recording sessions, because Richard was going through a heavy drug addiction, and it made Roger Waters do the decision to fire him before Roger himself left Pink Floyd after the final cut. To me, The Wall is a beautiful sounding album. There's a lot of great stuff on there, but I still defend my opinion. It is not one of the classic albums of all time in terms of, you know, how popular any double album really is, but I respect its influence. It has been a very iconic concept album, just like with Dark Side of the Moon. The Wall's got a bit of filler here and there, and I don't think the concept is entirely as consistent as the others I love. Besides that, the album is one of my favourite Pink Floyd albums. I do think Dark Side of the Moon is still, for me, along with The Wall, the most overrated Pink Floyd album, and yet I love that album personally more than The Wall. But you can't go wrong with, as you said, with the classic amazing guitar solos from David Gilmour, and some of my Pink Floyd favourite songs are from this album, like Goodbye Blue Sky, Is There Anybody Out There, and I thought the first half of The Wall is a lot stronger than the second half, in my opinion. As far as classic albums I can't get into, there are other examples I would like to bring into this discussion. These include the untitled fourth Led Zeppelin album of 1971, Rumours by Fleetwood Mac, Let It Be by the Beatles, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road by Elton John, The Joshua Tree by U2, and Thriller by Michael Jackson. I can't stand that album. In fact, Thriller is also the album that revolutionized the music industry standards. I do think Led Zeppelin's fourth album is, while not being my favorite, it is another classic rock album in terms of its legendary status. There's other great songs like Black Dog, When the Levee Breaks, and Going to California. Led Zeppelin 2 is my favorite Led Zeppelin album, but I cannot apologize that that album is still one of my most favorite albums from Led Zeppelin. As with Rumours by Fleetwood Mac, that is pretty surprising because, yes, we all know Don't Stop, Go Your Own Way, and The Chain, which The Chain is the highlight of the whole album, besides the other ones that I do love, like Songbird, Secondhand News, and Dreams. The whole album is a beautiful, personal, and emotional, and yet timeless record, especially for the production. The Beatles' Let It Be, I don't see it as a classic. I don't think there's a lot of this stuff from that time of the Beatles that follows the uniqueness and the strong originality like what Sgt. Pepper's, Abbey Road, and Revolver did present to us previously. But even though the Beatles were going through a lot of a difficult time before they actually decided to skip the sessions for Get Back and move into Abbey Road, and Let It Be was one of those albums that I thought at first was one of my least favourites, but it is a very rough, around the edges, and yet highly favourable album for me, but it's not a classic Beatles record. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road by Elton John, that was a pretty big surprise. The well-beloved classic album from one of the legendary singer-songwriters of all time. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road is not my favourite from his discography, but it still shines through incredible melodies, awesome songwriting, and you can't go wrong with some of Elton's best songs. Some of them are on this record, besides the songs from Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy to Honky Chateau. And Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, to me, is one of his best albums in his discography. I can't really say anything about The Joshua Tree by U2 because, yeah, I know loads of people see that one as their favourite or their best album, or even both to begin with, but I'm not a fan of U2. They are one of those bands that I have tried to dive in with. It's just that, you know, the songwriting in places to some of the songs, they are enjoyable, but they've never been a gravitating band to fully be connecting with even better. I don't mind hearing them occasionally, so I can't really say a lot of comments for me to talk about The Joshua Tree, and I apologise. As with Thriller by Michael Jackson, I don't see the album as just the only one that revolutionised the music industry. It is definitely one of them because it is obviously the biggest selling album of all time in the world than any other record. But as an album, besides most of the album are the singles, it's still a timeless banger of a record. And I love Billie Jean to Thriller and Beat It. Just everything about the record proves that Michael Jackson's artistic freedom and determination to make pop as highly relevant back then to today is still incredible. I know that a lot of people love Off the Wall, maybe more than this album, or Bad, but as much as I'm a fan of Michael Jackson, Thriller's, to me, always one of the best pop albums of all time. But I completely understand why you've been against Thriller because of its increased popularity. it does not mean to say that it's not a bad album at all for me. It's good that you address this topic, as I have always been disillusioned with classic albums that have been bombarded by either worldwide stardom or by success. Like I said regarding Thriller by Michael Jackson, that album has set a new standard for the music industry, where every song has to be a massive hit song. It's something that I've always disagreed with, and everywhere I go, I listen to the same hit songs over and over again. I think sometimes we have to recognise that this sort of success is too deeply ingrained with every decade, not to mention that the Beatles have had worldwide stardom and success in the 1960s. That's completely fair enough. Fans have been incredibly tired sometimes of hearing everything that has been on repeat non-stop over and over again, but I know they are still great songs. I appreciate what you're saying, that it could be leading into a huge burnout to the point that we would be getting very sick and tired of hearing the songs, just as monotonously played constantly, rather than, thinking about them as proper songs, and to be over popularizing the whole thing about music. I think a big problem with overplaying songs is it's making a lot of classic songs feel like it's losing the importance of what the songs really represent. And I know so many people would play the same singles billions of times, because it's not just because they are big hits, they just overplay the same stuff without exploring anything else. And that is what's very annoying about it sometimes. So yeah, these are my thoughts about albums that I think that I just find impossible to get into. Do you have any particular reasons why some classic albums are impossible to get into? I'd be very interested in hearing your opinion about it. I will be saying more of this type of answer for some of the comments that I'm going to read from the other guys. So thank you very much, Ryan Rupre, for your lengthy, really enjoyable reading comment. Shizazzle, for me, Abbey Road. Just haven't been a big fan of that one. Neither Sgt. Pepper's, Purple Rain by Prince as well, and probably some other albums as well. Abbey Road, one of the albums that I always define as one of my favourite final albums by any band, if not potentially one of my top 3 favourite albums from a band that has obviously been a revolution. Abbey Road is a very strong, highly crisp, dynamic album, and for it to finalise the legendary band's discography is perfect. I could never find any flaw around the album, even though some fans would see criticisms about Octopus's Garden or Maxwell's Silver Hammer, but the other stuff, like the second half, the medley is sublime, from Golden Slumbers to The End, to other songs like the George Harrison epics Here Comes the Sun and Something, which is one of my most favourite Beatles songs of all time, and Paul McCartney's vocal melodies on songs like You Never Give Me Your Money and Oh Darling. They are outstanding. The production is top tier when it comes to production from the Beatles catalogue. That was quite a shock to see Abbey Road as one of your picks, Shizazzle. And same with Sgt. Pepper's, but on Sgt. Pepper's, it is even more obvious. Viewers and music fans would maybe see that album as maybe the most overrated album of all time, or, just a good Beatles album, but not one of the classics. Sgt. Pepper's is not only, along with Revolver, my favourite album of all time, but I think it is acceptable to see Sgt. Pepper's as the most important album of all time because of what it is, and it has been documented and talked about so aggressively non-stop. So everyone knows about Sgt. Pepper's, and to see you mentioning this album in particular, I'm not as surprised, but I do get where you're coming from. Purple Rain by Prince, it is not my favourite Prince record. It has to be Sign of the Times. And the other albums, like some from his time with The Revolution, his backing band, like Around the World in a Day, to some of the later stuff like Emancipation, they are excellent, amazing albums. Purple Rain is, to me, quite a very common record. Purple Rain is one Prince record when it's very, very good. Well, thank you very much for your comment, Shizazzle. Penultimate commenter, Midnight Social. Tommy by The Who, just boring and uninteresting. Although this describes my opinion of The Who in general, The Who are one of my top 3 favourite rock bands of all time. And Tommy is more or less like a very non-serious but more of a characteristic concept album, while it is not as a complete, strong, deeper context of a concept like their magnum opus, Quadrophenia, in my opinion. Tommy did have a bit of a flaw with the concept when it feels like, at points, a bit wishy-washy and not as connected, but it obviously focuses around the deaf, dumb and blind boy, and with the other characters, it's an unusual concept album, but that's what I love about the album. It's not meant to really be taken into a heavily personal or a deeper context, like with another Who album, for example, like The Who by Numbers, the album after Quadrophenia. I don't think Tommy is a boring record at all ever since I really got into the band heavily. I think it's an interesting thing on paper, but I think in terms of execution, it's like a jolly, melodic and playful album. But in terms of the concept, when Townshend was at his peak, it has to be, besides Quadrophenia, Who's Next is one of the best ones too. The Wall, once again by Pink Floyd, too much filler, too long and self-indulgent. Roger Waters did go through a huge breaking point for him mentally and emotionally, but the filler part, I do agree. While the filler is nothing like so unlistenable, I think some of the songs don't really follow the imagination and the investment of me listening to the album heavily to be fully connected with the experience. While The Wall, as I said earlier, is one of my favourite Pink Floyd albums, I do see The Wall as, one of the other ones I don't see as a classic and not one of the greatest of all time. London Calling by The Clash, mixed bag, some amazing songs, some average stuff, not even Clash's best album in my opinion. Double albums can be very picky for me, and London Calling by The Clash is one album as a double album which I like some of it, but The Clash have never been one of my favourite bands. I do have a few of their albums on vinyl, but they were chosen by me from one of my friends who was giving his records away, and I didn't mind The Clash. I liked some of their stuff at the time. But with London Calling, just like with the other ones, like Tommy and The Wall, and even Exile on Main Street by the Rolling Stones, it is not ignorable to see records like London Calling anywhere you go. It's just that big, that iconic album. But in terms of the album itself, there's some stuff that I do legitimately enjoy and like for quite a bit, but it's not one of my favourite albums in the double album way of listening to music. And the last one, American Idiot by Green Day. Who asked for a political punk rock opera? Certainly not me. It's not aged great, and I've never enjoyed it. To tell you the truth, I thought Green Day were my favourite band in the whole world when I was really, really young, and American Idiot was quite an impactful album for me, besides that it was the first Green Day album that I was getting into. I still love the 90s and the early 2000s Green Day, never keen on the later stuff post American Idiot, or even after 21st Century Breakdown to begin with. Oh, father of all. But American Idiot is to me Green Day at the last good moments. I really like the album. I thought it was an interesting concept album when I was looking into what Billie Joe Armstrong was going through, and there's a bit of the personal stuff through some of the songs on there, like Wake Me Up When September Ends, and I find American Idiot still to be a great banger of a song. American Idiot is one really good album that, to me, proves Green Day to be, at the time, highly relevant, but I do understand that they've not aged very well when it comes to the later stuff from my own vision and ears when I listened to Green Day's later stuff. And I have not, by the way, listened to their new album that came out a few months back, because after Father of All, I really cannot be bothered to come back to the newer periods of Green Day any longer. Thank you very much, Midnight Social. And the last one from Billy Bishop. Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses is very overrated, and that album is played to death. I highly agree 100%. Some people see that album as one of the most overrated albums, yet I really appreciate its universal acclaim and stardom. For Guns N' Roses to be popping up immediately with a huge status of positive reception for a debut album. Appetite for Destruction was actually an album that I was originally going to buy when I was a teenager to grow more of my CD collection. But yeah, thank you very much for the comment, Billy Bishop. I want to say a few albums that are classics, many people love, that I can't get into. The first one, the now aforementioned Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. I think the album is always not one of the best rock records in terms of favoritism. I admire it heavily that it was like a big dominating achievement to keep the relevance of rock music carrying on, and it's still going ahead. Obviously, one of the biggest iconic rock albums in the world. Despite that, I'm not interested at all to hear the singles anymore. When it comes to some of the songs that are not the singles, I sometimes hear them on the radio. They're just so mediocre and not interesting to me. It's not just because of Axl Rose, by the way, even though I still loathe him. The talent is there, the musicianship is there, but as an album, I will never have an interest of making my own time be carrying forward by listening to an album like Appetite for Destruction that I always regard as the most overrated rock album of all time. The next one is probably going to surprise some people, and that is the Jesus and Mary Chain Psycho Candy. I bought it because one of my all-time favourite bands, My Bloody Valentine, are fans of the album. But when I listened to it, the biggest negative about it was the overall thin, highly reverb-sounding production. It was just difficult to digest. The songwriting is obviously there for me, of wanting to know what is going on. There were times that I do like some of the songs on the album, but in the end, from the experience, it's a very average record that I cannot get into. I know, by the way, that the Jesus and Mary Chain have released a brand new studio album, I believe. Psycho Candy later on had become, like Appetite for Destruction, a big influential album, and My Bloody Valentine being fans of the band, they wanted to make a similar sound to the Jesus and Mary Chain before they went into their incredible signature shoegaze, dream pop sounds of their music later on. The songs have always been there in the placement from my listening to it, but the way it sounds and the mixing is just not always a comfortable journey to get into what is going on. Not that it's a bad album, obviously, but I do get its importance that it was something pretty unexpected in the different side of artistic detail and music for different styles. The Clash's London Calling is one of my picks as well. Obviously, it's the biggest album they've ever released, and like with Exile on Main Street, big album for variety. There's some parts when it can be pretty poppy, a bit bluesy, and bits of like ska and reggae influences. And by the way, The Clash are never always a punk band when it comes to some of their albums. Some of the earlier stuff is more punk rock side, but London Calling is where the open-mindedness is very noticeable. I like the direction for that. Just like with bands like the Rolling Stones to Pink Floyd, even the Beatles, obviously, when they decide to explore and search for a bigger virtuosity mindset for them to carry on forward as a band and, more importantly, as musicians. London Calling is a solid album, but it's not one of my favourite double albums of all time, as a lot of music listeners do heavily regard that one as one of the best. And there you have it, guys. That is my brief amount of answers on the last bit to reading your comments from your answers to summarize everything up on what classic albums many people love, you can't get into. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you guys want to participate by sharing your answers down below in the comments under this video, do feel free to do so. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future.